Imagine for a moment, you've been at sea for 3 months without sight of land, surrounded by hundreds of men who haven't bathed in just as long as you. The stench is unbearable, but that's just the tip of the iceberg in a sanitary nightmare that few today could even imagine. Have you ever wondered what life was really like aboard those ships that crossed oceans for months on end? I'm not talking about the luxurious transatlantic liners of the 20th century, but the true workhorses of the seas, Spanish galleons, pirate ships, and the vessels of the British Royal Navy from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The story I'm about to tell isn't for the faint of heart. It's about a reality so brutal and nauseating it seems ripped from a horror film, except it all actually happened day after day during endless months aboard floating hells. But here's the question that intrigues me. How did these men survive under conditions we would now consider utterly inhuman? And more importantly, why did they accept to live like this? Let's start with the obvious, or what should be obvious. Fresh water was the most precious commodity on any old ship. But do you realize just how precious it really was? On a typical voyage from Lisbon to the Indies, which lasted between 6 to 8 months, each sailor was allowed roughly 1 liter of water per day. 1 liter for drinking, cooking, and, well, theoretically for washing too. But here's the first cruel dilemma. Would you drink your water ration or use it to try and clean yourself? The answer was always the same. The water was for drinking. Christopher Columbus in his ship logs mentions that after just 2 weeks at sea, the water in the barrels already had a peculiar taste, a euphemism for rotten water, infested with larvae and carrying a stench that would make any modern person vomit instantly. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. Imagine this scene. A sailor boards with 2 changes of clothes, if he's lucky. For the entire voyage, which could last up to 8 months, that's all the clothing he'll have. There's no laundry, no soap, and not nearly enough water to wash anything. The clothes would literally rot on their bodies. Francis Drake, the famous English privateer, described in a letter to Queen Elizabeth I a situation that left me stunned. The men are so filthy their garments fall apart at a touch, and the stench is such that even the rats flee from their bunks. Can you imagine a smell so strong that even rats, creatures known to thrive in sewers, ran away? But here's an even more disturbing question. If the clothes were rotting, what was happening to the skin beneath them? Dr. James Lind, a physician of the British Royal Navy in the 18th century, documented something that still sends chills down my spine. The skin of sailors, after months without proper hygiene, develops a thick crust of dirt, crystallized sweat, sea salt, and other substances I prefer not to name. This crust wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. It became the perfect breeding ground for lice, fleas, mites, and a shocking variety of parasites that found paradise there. Men would scratch themselves raw, creating wounds that quickly became infected in the ship's damp, filthy environment. But perhaps the most shocking thing of all is this. Many sailors believed that this layer of filth protected them from cold and disease. The belief was so deeply ingrained that some deliberately avoided any attempt at cleaning themselves, even when they had the chance. Samuel Pepys, in his famous diary, recounts an encounter with sailors returning from a 6-month voyage. The smell was so unbearable I had to cover my nose with a cloth soaked in vinegar. One of the men told me proudly that he had not touched water to his body in 5 months, for he believed it kept him strong. Now brace yourself for something that goes beyond disgusting, into the realm of the absolutely bizarre. Sailors' hair became literal wildlife sanctuaries. I'm not exaggerating. Historical documents describe hair so matted and filthy that entire colonies of insects lived in it. Captain James Cook wrote in his journal, "I ordered 2 men's hair to be cut completely, as they could no longer remove their hats due to the tangling. When the hair was cut, we found not only lice but tiny crabs, worms, and even a type of fungus I'd never seen before. Tiny crabs. In human hair." But here's what truly intrigues me. How did these men sleep at night? How could they have any moment of peace with that wildlife literally living on their heads? The answer might be more disturbing than we can imagine. The bunks on old ships were true nighttime battlegrounds. Imagine sharing a hammock or a space of less than 1 square meter with another man, both carrying months of filth, insects, and skin diseases. Thomas Nash, a 17th century English sailor, left behind a haunting account. The nights are worse than the days. The sound of scratching is constant. It's like rain hitting the hull. Men cry softly, not from homesickness, but from the despair of an itch that never ends. The sound of scratching like rain. Can you picture that? But there was something even worse than the constant itching, the skin diseases that spread like wildfire. Scabies, impetigo, bacterial eczema, conditions we now easily treat with antibiotics, but which back then turned men into walking monstrosities. And here's what truly baffles me. How did these men not all die from infection? How could they function as an efficient crew under such conditions? The answer might lie in the most extraordinary and disturbing adaptation of the human species. Dr. William Cockburn, an 18th century naval doctor, proposed a revolutionary theory. The human body, in extreme necessity, develops an extraordinary tolerance to filth and parasites. It's as if the immune system enters a state of constant, controlled warfare. Essentially, these men became different kinds of human beings. Their bodies adapted to live in symbiosis with parasites and bacteria in ways our modern bodies simply couldn't handle. But that adaptation came at a terrible price. Sailors who managed to complete multiple long voyages developed distinctive physical traits. Not just scars or sunburn, I'm talking about fundamental changes. Their skin became extraordinarily thick and tough, almost like leather. Their digestive systems could process food that would be completely rotten for any normal person. And their noses simply stopped functioning properly. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, the infamous pirate, was known to eat meat that had rotted for weeks, drink water green with algae, and sleep peacefully amid smells that would make others faint. But perhaps the most disturbing adaptation was psychological. Something fascinating and terrible happened to the minds of these men after months at sea. They began to see cleanliness as unnatural, even dangerous. There are documented accounts of sailors who, upon returning to dry land, violently refused to bathe or change clothes. They genuinely believed cleanliness would make them vulnerable to disease. John Hawkins, an English privateer, wrote about one of his men. John, after 8 months at sea, was forced by his wife to bathe when he returned to Plymouth. The next day, he developed a terrible fever and died within 3 days. The other men said I had killed him by allowing him to be washed. Coincidence? Maybe. But this belief became so strong that it created a vicious cycle. The dirtier they were, the more they believed the filth protected them, but it wasn't complete filth all the time. Ships developed their own bizarre hygiene rituals, if we can even call them that. Once a week, usually on Sundays, they held what was called a lice inspection. All the men would line up on the deck and be checked while officers literally counted how many lice each man had. Not to eliminate them, that was impossible, but to establish a hierarchy. Men with fewer lice were considered healthier and received slightly better rations. Can you imagine a society where the number of parasites on your body determines your social status? But there was an even more bizarre ritual: the vinegar bath. Once a month, when supplies allowed, the sailors were washed with a mixture of vinegar, rum, and seawater. It wasn't really a bath, more like scrubbing an acidic substance onto months of accumulated filth. The result was agonizing. The vinegar burned through wounds and skin irritations, causing unbearable pain. But curiously, it also killed some parasites and temporarily reduced the stench. Thomas Cavendish described the experience. The screams of men during the vinegar bath echo through the ship for hours. It's as if we're torturing our own crew. But the next day, the relief on their faces shows the suffering was worth it. Pain as relief from itching. It's a complete inversion of everything we consider normal. Something even stranger happened. During longer voyages, the men developed a kind of social hibernation. They stopped speaking unnecessarily, conserved energy, and moved as if in a trance. Dr. Francis Pretty, who accompanied Sir Francis Drake on his circumnavigation, observed, "After the 3rd month, the men become almost ghost-like. They perform their duties mechanically but rarely speak or interact. It's as if their souls had temporarily withdrawn from their filthy bodies. This hibernation may have been a psychological adaptation to cope with the constant trauma of living in subhuman conditions. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is what happened when these ships finally arrived at their destinations. The reaction of people in port cities was one of absolute horror. There are records of port authorities literally forbidding sailors from disembarking until they were properly cleaned, a process that could take days. In Seville in the 16th century, a special area was built in the harbor called La Zona de Purificación, where sailors were literally scrubbed with stiff bristled brushes, potash soap, and boiling water before being allowed to enter the city. The process was so brutal that some men preferred to remain aboard the ships. But here's the most disturbing aspect of this entire story. For these men, life on the ship had become normal. The dirt, the parasites, the unbearable stench, all of. It was their reality. When forced to clean themselves, many reported feeling naked, vulnerable, and sick. Their identities were so tied to that condition that cleanliness triggered an existential crisis. Captain Edward Davis wrote, "My men, after 6 months at sea, weep when forced to bathe, not from shame, but from genuine fear. They believe they're being stripped of their natural protection." This story doesn't end in centuries past. The psychological effects of that experience echoed through generations of seafaring families. Modern genealogical studies show that descendants of 16th to 18th century sailors exhibit unique behavioral patterns related to hygiene and cleanliness. Some families developed obsessive cleaning rituals, while others retained a subconscious resistance to modern hygiene standards. It's as if the traumatic memory of that experience was etched into their familial DNA. But the question that haunts me is this: if these men managed to survive and even thrive in conditions we consider impossible, what does that say about the limits of human adaptation? Are we, with our modern standards of cleanliness, actually more fragile than our ancestors? Or have we developed something more valuable, the ability to live with dignity? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between those extremes. Perhaps the real lesson of this horrific story is about resilience, adaptation, and the price we sometimes pay for survival. When I look at the ocean today, I can't help but imagine those ghostly ships carrying their human cargo under conditions that defy imagination. And I wonder, what other stories of extreme adaptation does humanity hide in its deep waters? The next time you complain about a day without a shower, remember this: there were men who sailed the world's oceans for months, carrying entire civilizations on their backs, without a single drop of clean water to wash their faces. Were they monsters, heroes, or simply human beings pushed to the absolute limit of existence? The answer, like the ocean they sailed, remains deep and mysterious.